Maggie Collins had a kind of elegance that didn't shout, it whispered. It was early on a Tuesday morning, cloudy and cold, when she decided to visit one of the city's most renowned luxury car dealerships. She wore dark jeans, a beige knit blouse, and a simple coat with no apparent brand. Her hair was tied up in an improvised bun, and her shoes, though clean, betrayed practicality over any hint of vanity. Maggie wasn't trying to impress anyone. At that point in her life, she spent her days taking care of the foundation she had established in the name of her daughter, lost years earlier, and tried to maintain a quiet routine, far from cameras and the assumptions tied to the Collins name. The salesman who greeted her, Blake Thompson, did not hide the judgment he made as soon as he saw her. The rehearsed smile he offered lasted less than 3 seconds before being replaced by an almost automatic expression of disdain. He took 2 steps forward, as if following protocol, and led her to the nearly new cars section, as if he were sure she wouldn't be interested or able to see the new models. When discussing the prices, he made a point of repeating the figures aloud with exaggerated intonation, as if expecting to see astonishment on her face. Maggie listened to it all in silence, her expression as serene as someone who had seen that kind of judgment before. Yet there was something about that day that struck her differently. It wasn't for her own sake, it was for the many other women who might face the same treatment and never get the chance to prove who they really were. If you have seen or experienced something similar, enjoy the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell. There are many real stories that need to be told here. Without realizing the complexity of the woman before him, Blake continued his apathetic presentation. He spoke hurriedly, averting his gaze, as if counting the minutes until that unlikely client would leave. When Maggie asked to see a newly released model, Blake hesitated for an instant, almost laughed, and said, "This one is well above the standard of what you're looking for, you understand?" That hurt her more than she expected, not because of the rudeness, but because of the way he felt so at ease, being openly condescending. Maggie thanked him politely, turned around, and left the store in silence. No one there imagined that this woman was married to Alexander Collins, one of the most respected and discreet names in the world of technology, known for avoiding public appearances and keeping his personal life away from the media. That night, on the porch at home with a cup of tea in hand, Maggie recounted to Alexander what had happened. She did not use an outraged tone, nor did she dramatize. She spoke softly, slowly, as if narrating something she had already expected. Her husband listened without interruption, with the attentiveness of someone who knew that, despite all the discretion, something had crossed a line. When she finished, he was silent for a few seconds. Then, with a slight nod, he said simply, "This isn't about you. It's about the kind of world we're helping to build, or allow to exist." Maggie agreed. They weren't seeking revenge, but they knew that this kind of behavior needed to be confronted, and more than that, it needed to be transformed, not by imposition, but through experience. And it was at that moment that Alexander had an idea. The next morning, the dealership buzzed with its usual activity. Cars gleamed in their showrooms, fresh coffee was served at the reception, and salespeople adjusted their blazers, ready to impress. Then, a Rolls-Royce Phantom, an exclusive model, slowly pulled up at the entrance. The driver got out first, opened the rear door, and with a firm and serene posture, Alexander Collins stepped out. He wore a tailored dark blue blazer, understated yet impeccably cut. Discreet glasses, a neatly trimmed beard, and a calm stride immediately turned heads. Blake, upon seeing him, nervously adjusted his tie and walked over with the artificial enthusiasm of someone eyeing a fat commission. "Good morning, sir. Welcome. How may I help you today?" he said in an almost sing-song voice. Alexander looked around, as if evaluating the environment before deciding whether it was worth entering. Then he fixed his gaze on Blake and replied calmly, "I want to speak with the manager responsible for the service this morning." Blake frowned, Not immediately. Understanding this morning? Alexander nodded. My wife was here. At that moment, Blake's face drained of color. It wasn't just the revelation of who the woman was, it was the clarity that he had mistreated someone who, at that moment, could bring his career down with a single sentence. Yes, of course. I can call the manager, Mr. Collins. The spoken name set off a chain reaction. One of the partners emerged from the back room looking confused. Alexander didn't raise his voice or get agitated. Instead, he spoke with the firmness of someone not there for status. I didn't come here to expose anyone. I came so that everyone here might reflect on how they treat those they think don't matter. The atmosphere, which just moments ago had been filled with forced smiles and rehearsed lines, was now heavy with awkward silence. The store partner, visibly disconcerted, called all the employees to the reception area. With his hands in his blazer pockets, Alexander waited for everyone to settle before continuing. My wife came here yesterday with the intention of buying a car. She was ignored, underestimated, and treated like someone invisible. And all this because of an assumption based solely on appearance. At that moment, Alexander's gaze rested directly on Blake, who lowered his eyes, unable to hide his discomfort. This isn't just a failure of service, it's a failure of character. And that, gentlemen, is the kind of thing that costs more than a lost sale. One of the partners tried to interject with formal apologies, but Alexander raised his hand, asking for silence. I didn't come here seeking an apology. I came to offer a chance for change. For a moment, everyone was confused. My wife runs a foundation that works with children with disabilities. It isn't a luxury environment. There are no bonuses for meeting targets. There, what matters is respect, empathy, the human touch. He paused. If Blake is willing, I'd like him to spend a month volunteering. There, not as punishment, but as an opportunity to see life from another angle, to understand that no one is worth less just because they aren't dressed as you expect. The partner hesitated, looking at Blake, who remained silent. I accept, he finally replied in a low, almost whisper-like voice. For the first time that day, he spoke without trying to impress anyone. Blake's first morning at the foundation was disconcerting. He arrived in a dress shirt and polished shoes, clearly out of place, among children in colorful sneakers and cartoon character t-shirts. Maggie welcomed him kindly, without mentioning the past, and introduced him to Anna, an 8-year-old girl with cerebral palsy, and a smile that suggested she knew more about life than many adults. She'll show you how things work around here, Maggie said with a light touch of humor. Blake tried to mask his discomfort, but he wasn't prepared for that kind of reality. Here, his corporate body language, his rehearsed phrases, and his superior air were of no use. In the first few days, everything felt like a struggle. He didn't know how to communicate, avoided eye contact, and every simple task seemed like a challenge. But Anna was undeterred. At one point, she handed him a sheet with a poorly colored drawing and said, I made this for you. It's ugly, isn't it? Caught off guard, Blake laughed for the first time since his arrival. It's beautiful, he replied without much thought. And so began, almost unnoticed, a transformation. He started to understand that he wasn't the one teaching anything, he was the one learning. Over time, he traded his dress shirt for simple t-shirts. He learned to push a wheelchair gently, to wait for each child's pace, and to celebrate small victories as if they were monumental achievements. Gradually, the forced smiles faded away, and what once felt like punishment became the best part of his day. By the third week, Blake began arriving earlier than everyone else. He set the dining room tables in order, sorted the colored pencils into little boxes, and prepared the art room, all without being asked. This wasn't part of his job description, yet he started to realize that when you truly care, you don't wait for someone to tell you what to do. Every day, Anna greeted him with a drawn-out, enthusiastic, "Hi, Blakey," and he would respond from afar with a nod and a smile that now came naturally. The children began calling him Uncle Elegant, even though he no longer wore his shiny shoes. He laughed at it, and for the first time in a long while, he laughed at himself too. On a rainy morning, while helping distribute snacks, one of the mothers approached him and said, "You treat my child with so much care. Thank you." That affected him more deeply than he had imagined. He wasn't quite sure what to say. He simply nodded and squinted as if holding back an emotion he couldn't let escape in front of everyone. Later that night, lying on his couch at home, he thought about the woman's words. He realized that no one had ever thanked him for treating someone with respect. In the world he came from, respect was a currency to be exchanged, not something given freely. But here at the foundation, things were different. It was a place where a person's value wasn't determined by what they wore or bought, but by the way they smiled and faced the world, even when the world insisted on being harsh. And that was slowly, yet profoundly, changing him. If this story moves you in any way, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a great time to join the community. The month passed faster than he had expected. When the day of the Foundation's charity event arrived, Blake volunteered to help with everything. He arrived early, helped set up tents, carried boxes, hung balloons, and distributed brochures with ease. There was no longer any pretense or the rush of someone merely fulfilling an obligation. It was him, wholly, present. Maggie watched from afar, saying little, knowing that something had changed, yet hoping he would be the one to speak it aloud. When the ceremony began, she took the stage and thanked all the volunteers and, without naming names, spoke about how empathy transforms. Sometimes you have to put yourself in someone else's shoes to see the world with new eyes. And when that happens, no one ever remains the same. After Maggie's speech, it was announced that one of the volunteers wished to say a few words. With sweaty hands, Blake took the stage. It wasn't something he usually did. He took a deep breath, looked at the children in the front rows, then at Maggie. "I didn't know what empathy was until I was here. I thought I knew, but I didn't." His voice wavered slightly, but he continued. "I judged someone by the way she dressed, and in that judgment, I revealed more about myself than about her. Today, I understand the magnitude of the mistake I made, and I want to apologize. And publicly, to Mrs. Collins and to everyone here, for the day I believed that someone's value was based on appearance rather than who they truly are." The room, previously silent, erupted into sincere applause, not for the courage to speak, but for the courage to change. After the event, Maggie approached Blake with her usual serene smile. There was no irony, no sense of superiority. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. He responded with a timid nod, and for a moment they stood in silence, watching children running with painted faces and paint-stained t-shirts. "I don't know how to thank you for this opportunity," he said, his voice now more resolute. "You've already thanked me," she replied, with attitude. It was then that Alexander appeared, greeted Blake with a sincere handshake, and said something that Blake would never forget. "Acknowledging a mistake is hard. Turning it into a lesson is rare. But you did both." Those words carried more weight than any bonus or recognition he had ever received in the corporate world. The following week, Maggie and Alexander decided to invite Blake to take on a new responsibility at the foundation, to lead a training program for young people in vulnerable situations. The idea was to use his experience in sales and customer service, but with a new purpose, to teach not only techniques, but also values. When he was called in for the conversation, Blake fell silent for a few seconds before accepting, not because he wanted to prove something, but because, for the first time, he felt he could use everything he knew in a way that truly made sense. On the first day of the program, standing before an attentive group of young people, he began by saying, "If I had learned what I'm about to teach you today, many things would have been different, but thankfully we can change. It's never too late to change." And thus began a new chapter, not only for him, but for everyone who listened. In the months that followed, Blake became a constant presence at the foundation, not just because of his new role, but because of the genuine connection he formed with people. It wasn't unusual to find him sitting on the floor with the children, helping assemble toys or listening to imaginative stories full of dragons, astronauts, and talking dogs. He no longer worried about the clock or the shine on his shoes. His vanity had taken on a different form. It now stemmed from the pride of seeing a young person land their first job, or a mother remarking that her child had started smiling again. Some former colleagues from the dealership even sought him out, curious about his transformation, and he would simply say, "There are things you only understand when you step out of your own place and allow yourself to truly see the world." Yet he never forgot the day it all began. That cold, dismissive service, that automatic decision to treat someone as less. It haunted him, not out of shame, but as a constant reminder of how blind he had been. One day, during a class with the program's youth, a student raised her hand and asked, "Uncle Blake, why did you decide to work with this and not sell cars?" He smiled. "Because here I sell something no one can buy, respect." For a few seconds, the room fell silent. Then came smiles, comments, and scribbles in notebooks. But Blake knew that his words were not just an answer. They were a conclusion. He had spent much of his life trying to prove himself in a world where people's value was measured by what they possessed. Now he lived in a place where value was measured by something invisible. But once noticed, it changed everything. One day, while walking through the foundation's courtyard, Blake saw Maggie sitting under a tree with a notebook on her lap. He approached slowly, careful not to interrupt, but she noticed him and smiled. "You know, sometimes I think about that morning," he said, stopping beside her. "At the dealership?" Maggie asked. He nodded. "It's strange, because today it feels like a different life." She closed her notebook and looked at him intently. Maybe it was. Sometimes you need to experience a small death in order to be reborn. You chose to change. Blake took a deep breath as he watched children running in the distance. "I thought I had everything under control, but I was only managing the superficial. Here I learned what true connection means, with others, with life." That same afternoon, Alexander arrived to pick up Maggie. He found them still, talking, sharing something deeper than mere words. He joined them, and the three stood together for a few minutes, simply observing the activity around them. At one point, Alexander remarked, "The foundation exists because of the pain we endured, but seeing the good it brings reminds us that even pain can be transformed." Blake nodded slightly. "Before all of this, I never stopped to think about the impact of my actions on others. Today, I think about it every day." Maggie smiled, not as someone who had won a battle, but as one witnessing a cycle coming full circle. It didn't erase what had happened in the past, but it showed that it had served a greater purpose. And in the end, maybe that was what truly mattered. Time passed, and although the foundation's routine continued its quiet rhythm, something had become solidified in everyone's story. Blake was no longer the vain dealership manager, nor the awkward volunteer trying to fit in. He had become part of the place, a part of a new way of seeing people. One day, while reviewing the program reports with Maggie, he remarked, "Funny, at first I thought I was here to teach, but I ended up learning the most." Maggie didn't reply immediately. She simply scribbled something on the corner of a sheet and handed it to him. It read, "The greatest lesson we can impart is to live what we have learned." He stared at the phrase for a few seconds, slipped the paper into his wallet, and never took it out again. Back at the old dealership, Blake's story became something of a legend. Some laughed, saying he had lost his mind. Others quietly admired the courage it took to leave everything behind. The dealership owner even sent messages after a while, congratulating him on his new phase. But for Blake, none of that mattered anymore. He had come to understand that true recognition doesn't come from titles or targets, but from the way we make others feel. And that was liberating. At the foundation meetings, he became the one who listened more than he spoke, who noticed the silences and gestures and who never again judged anyone by appearance. Years later, during another foundation event, a young woman approached him and said, "You're Blake, right? I joined the program because of you. I heard your story and wanted to change too." He smiled. He said nothing at first, but in that moment he realized, without needing applause, that his mistake had become a seed, that his transformation had inspired others, and that was more significant than any apology. Maggie watched from afar, standing beside Alexander with that same calm and determined look, a look of someone who had seen the worst in people, but also the best. And at that moment, Blake was no longer just the man who judged wrongly. He was the man who chose to do things differently, and for that, he was at peace. If this story touched you, leave a like, share it with someone who deserves to hear it, and hit the bell so you won't miss the next accounts. Transformation can begin with a click.